Hello, everyone. Good evening. Today, Professor Williamson will give his 8th lecture. The title is Philosophy and its Neighbours. Welcome. Okay.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about the relations between philosophy and its neighbours in the sense of its neighbouring disciplines, so the ones that it's close to. And as you'll see, there are many disciplines that philosophy is close to and perhaps even overlaps. So one of several reasons for being interested in this question from a more general perspective on the methodology and nature of philosophy is to use it to think about the question of whether there is progress in philosophy. Because according to some people, there is no progress in philosophy. Philosophy does not get better as time goes on. And usually when people say that, they intend it as a complaint or a criticism of philosophy, that it's making no progress. But although it's not always intended in that way, I mean, some people compare philosophy to literature, and they think that there might be no progress in philosophy in the same way that there's no progress in literature. I'm not sure that there's no progress in literature. I think my own view is probably there are both progress and decline in literature. But it certainly seems that the literature written 3,000 years ago can still be, of the very highest quality, that it's not simply been completely superseded by modern literature. But in the case of philosophy, we might hope that it's different, because I've been presenting a view of philosophy on which it's similar to other sciences in its aims and methods, and as a result makes progress in similar ways. And of course, you might doubt that. And I think one way of assessing those doubts is by considering areas where philosophy is very close to other disciplines. And I think using those areas of where they're just on different sides of a border, but close to each other or even overlapping each other. I think we can see that it's really extremely implausible to claim that all those other sciences make progress, but philosophy does not, when it's so close to them and so similar to them. I mean, of course, if you were very skeptical and pessimistic, you might think that none of these sciences make progress, but I don't think that's a very plausible point of view. I think it's much more plausible that these other sciences make progress, and therefore we would expect that philosophy is making progress because of its similarity to them. So that's one kind of argument that I'll be suggesting in what follows. So we're going to be looking, as I say, at regions of contiguity or overlap between philosophy and other sciences. And naturally, on the whole, these areas will tend to concern the more theoretical aspects of the other sciences, rather than, for example, the more experimental or data gathering sides. I mean, that's not going to be surprising. in fact, when you think about some of the natural sciences, it sometimes seems that it may be that as we're, let's say, physics, that theoretical physics may seem more similar to some parts of philosophy than it is to experimental physics, in the kind of work that scientists are doing. And in fact, when you look at these areas where one discipline is next to philosophy or overlaps with philosophy, it's not so unusual to find that there are people who have very serious training in both philosophy and this other science. I mean, for example, I know people who have a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in physics, or a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in biology. And it's not because they've had some kind of conversion experience and started to hate one side and then do something completely different. That's reflected the natural combination of interests, or the location of their interests that they had all along, or at least some very kind of continuous development in their interests. So the first case that I'm going to talk about is the relation between philosophy and physics, which is one that I sort of hear quite a bit about, because at Oxford, it's possible for the undergraduates to do a course. To do their undergraduate degree in physics and philosophy. And we have quite a few people who are doing philosophy of physics to teach them, and it's a very natural combination. We get very good students who want to do this combination, and of course, one thing that makes it less surprising is that after all, the physics only divert. Oh, there's something wrong in the handout there. It says physics only diverged from physics. It should say physics only diverged from philosophy in the 18th century. Something wrong with the slide. So, of course, it used to be that what would now be called physics, used to be called natural philosophy. So there's a kind of area where philosophy of physics pretty much overlaps with highly theoretical physics, where you have conferences, for example, where some of the people present are philosophers of physics and some are theoretical physicists. But it may be that possibly the biggest difference between those people is just that some of them are in a department of philosophy, the philosophers of physics, and some are in departments of theoretical physics. There are sometimes people, who move from a department of physics to a department of philosophy because of the kind of interests that they have, but they're working on the same things all along. Of course, these areas where there's a close connection, they tend to be in certain specific areas of theoretical physics, where it seems that philosophy has got something special to offer or to learn from the physics, and so they're particularly concerned with what you might call foundational theories in physics, like quantum mechanics and special and general relativity. So it's only in certain areas that you get this coming together of the philosophers of physics and theoretical physics. But there are crucial areas where that does happen. And one of the obvious areas to talk about in this connection is in discussions of different interpretations of quantum mechanics, which of course used to be that the Copenhagen interpretation was the dominant one, but increasingly others are being taken seriously, such as the many worlds interpretation. And these are theoretical questions on which the philosophers quite naturally have something to add. I mean, in the case of the many worlds interpretation, of course, there's some similarity between the many worlds interpretations of quantum mechanics and the ideas about possible worlds that you get in metaphysicians like David Lewis. I mean, they're not completely the same thing for various specific reasons, but it's certainly the case that philosophers who've studied metaphysics have been thinking about issues which are not completely different from those that are being talked about by the physicists. And similarly, the kinds of question that theoretical physicists are concerned with about, let's say, the interpretation of the probabilities that are so important in quantum mechanics, what these probabilities mean. Those are questions which have a quite strongly philosophical aspect to them, and so the discussions that go on, are not totally unlike debates about the nature of probability, but to what extent they're objective, whether there's an epistemic aspect to them, whether they're connected with something like decision theory. So that these kind of theoretical questions are ones which, just as when they naturally have a philosophical aspect to them, although they're also very strongly, pressingly raised by the nature of the physics itself. So, to a certain extent, philosophers of physics and physicists are working on the same general issues. I mean, there may be certain differences in style between them, but that's also true amongst the philosophers of physics. Some of them may be more like theoretical physicists, and others are more like metaphysicians. But that's a kind of continuum, and I mean there's no sort of natural line here that would divide the philosophers from the physicists, except for the external institutional line of whether they happen to be in a philosophy department or in a physics department. So that, as I say, that's one area where there are very close connections between philosophy and physics. And another area concerns, as I mentioned, Einstein's special and general relativity, and I think one of the issues that raises is questions about our understanding of time, and to what extent something like a more or less commonsensical view of time, if there is one, is consistent with special relativity, and mean, some philosophers, for example, like Hilary Putnam, have argued that that the idea that only the present is real has to be abandoned in the light of special relativity. Excuse me. Because if there's no preferred frame of reference, and what counts as the present depends on which frame of reference you have. I mean, that argument has in turn been challenged, but I think it's very clear that any properly considered view of the philosophy of time has got to take special relativity into account. And even if in the end it's going to defend some kind of commonsensical ideas about time that you might have had before you knew anything about special relativity, it will still have to do a lot of explaining to show that that those commonsensical ideas are really consistent with special relativity, and I think a little bit more than consistent, but that they form, you know, a coherent and plausible picture combined with special relativity. I mean, it's just having arbitrarily saying that there's a preferred frame of reference, but what's special about it is nothing that you can understand from the point of view of physics. That would not be a terribly plausible view of the philosophy of time. So that's a second area where philosophy and physics come together, where and where it's not simply some kind of special interest of philosophers of physics, but it's an area where the physics seems to have important implications for much more general questions in metaphysics about the nature of time and space. So now I'm going to take another case, which is philosophy and biology. So the philosophy of biology also overlaps highly theoretical biology in a way that's not so different from the case of physics. And again, the areas of natural overlap will just be certain, perhaps somewhat problematic areas in theoretical biology. And one sort of example of that is the theory of evolution, and that there are all kinds of issues about what the appropriate units of selection are and how you individuate species, which have a strongly philosophical aspect to them. And I mean, for example, you know, I know a philosopher of biology who started out as just as studying biology, and then he got involved in certain theoretical issues about the individuation of species, and he found that the best things that had been written about these issues in theoretical biology had been written by a philosopher, in fact, by Elliot Sober. And so that was what drew him into philosophy, but he's still retained his theoretical interest in biology. So I mean, so that's a case where the kind of contribution that a philosopher of biology was making was one that was recognizable as a significant contribution to theoretical biology from someone coming to it from the biology side. It wasn't that, as it were, you first of all had to be a philosopher before you could be interested in what this person had done. And Actually, in my own work, although I certainly do not count as a philosopher of biology, but in my work on criteria of identity, I was interested in the case of the individuation of species, because one of the criteria that have been proposed for when different populations belong to the same species and when they don't is whether the two populations are capable of interbreeding. But the problem with that criterion is that it raises a logical issue, because you can have three populations, X, Y, and Z, where X is capable of interbreeding with Y, and Y is capable of interbreeding with Z, but X is not capable of interbreeding with Z. In logical terms, the possible interbreeding relation is non-transitive, and that means that it's you get incoherent results if you try to use it as a necessary and sufficient condition for the identity of the species to which these different populations belong. And in some of my early work, I was interested in the problem of what you do when you have a plausible criterion of identity, but it's non-transitive, and so it's actually logically disqualified from being a necessary and sufficient condition for identity. And I was interested in the various kinds of fallback, where you have a criterion which is logically satisfactory, but kind of is a sort of best approximation in some sense to the original criterion. So as a philosopher, I'd got interested in the question of the individuation of species, but coming at it from a purely logical point of view. So that's how both a biologist could get interested in philosophy, and a philosopher could get interested in biology, because of the way in which there are issues that come up in theoretical biology, which just are in this area of overlap between philosophy and biology. And another area where there's overlap between philosophy and biology is in theories of biological function. For example, when we talk about what a certain what's the function of a certain organ, like the function of the heart is to pump blood or something, and of course it's an interesting question what the significance of this talk about function is, because it's in some way we seem to be dealing with something that's teleological, that has to do with a purpose, even though there is no agent whose purpose it is. And of course, there are ways of explaining the idea of the function of something, which don't invoke any kind of mysterious purpose. But that, again, is an area where philosophy and biology come very close together, where philosophers and biologists are interested in these ideas of function, and where each side has something to contribute. I mean, philosophers have contributed quite a bit on the very general notion of a function. And another example of the close connection between philosophy and biology would be the work of Ruth Garrett Millikan, who's wrote a book on language, thought, and other biological categories, as she put it. And so there she's drawing on biological thinking to understand phenomena in philosophy of thought and epistemology and philosophy of language. And once again, when you look at these areas, there just is no kind of natural boundary where you could say, well, it's philosophy on one side of this boundary and biology on the other side. It seems that people from both sides are legitimately interested in, to some extent, the very same question. And the main boundary in the area is just the institutional one between people who are in philosophy departments and people who are in biology departments. Of course, which department you're in is likely to affect you in some ways because of the people that you spend your time interacting with and so on. And so institutional differences can have all sorts of knock-on effects in intellectual culture. But it seems that, as it were, the underlying space of questions to be asked is one where there is not any natural boundary between philosophy and biology, and where there are areas where it would be perfectly sensible to describe what's being talked about as both philosophy and biology. So now I'll do another comparison, which is between philosophy and psychology, which is, again, that's a combination of disciplines which many students in Oxford have studied for their first degree. It's worth remembering that psychology diverged even more recently from philosophy than physics did, really, I guess, only in the 19th century. As maybe I mentioned, my first teaching job was at Trinity College Dublin, where I was in a school of mental and moral science. And the mental science really had originally been psychology, and the moral science was the philosophy. So that it took a long time for those two subjects to separate. And given that a lot of philosophy is concerned with the mind, and so is psychology, of course, it's completely unsurprising that they have this very close connection. And when you read a philosopher like David Hume, it seems that what he's doing is both philosophy and psychology. And of course, the relevant branches that we would now think divide philosophy into that overlap theoretical psychology, they're going to be called philosophy of mind and philosophical psychology. Although there are plenty of other areas of philosophy where psychology is in fact very relevant. For example, in epistemology, I think, in fact, it would be better if epistemologists knew more psychology, because often they're making assumptions about the mind. For example, about how much in the mind goes on at the level of consciousness, and how much is below the level of consciousness. They're making assumptions about the role of consciousness, which are not very plausible in the light of contemporary psychology, without really being aware that they're assuming anything in particular at all. So, an example of the interaction between the two is a famous article written by Noam Chomsky, who's, of course, is primarily a linguist, which was a critique of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, which, Skinner had just published a book, this was in the late 1950s, called Linguistic Behavior, which was a behaviorist approach to language, where behaviorism was at that time was the dominant school in psychology, and of course, behaviorists claimed that they were that their focus on behavior was the scientific way to study the mind. And Chomsky argued very powerfully and influentially that, in fact, the behaviorist approach was extremely unscientific, and that it did not match up to what the natural sciences normally did. And in using that, he was actually using quite a bit of the philosophy of science of the time. So there was a strongly philosophical aspect to his critique of Skinner. But that very long review that he wrote of Skinner's book is at least conventionally taken as a kind of turning point in the history of psychology, where behaviorism started to be recognized as a very inadequate way of studying the mind, and where cognitive psychology that took the mental structures seriously as something more than just as were behavioral dispositions or something like that. That was where such cognitive psychology started to become influential again. Of course, behaviorism itself, had not always been the dominant school in psychology, but it had been for some decades, at least, on a kind of simple version of the history. So there was a strongly philosophical aspect to that theoretical turn in psychology. And another kind of example would be the work of the philosopher of mind Jerry Fodor, where he did work which was both strongly influenced by what was going on in psychology, but also to some extent influential on what happened in psychology. And two examples of that, maybe the most important two, are his work on the language of thought, the idea that a computational theory of mind requires that to be some kind of internal language in which we think, maybe something more like the language that a computer does its internal processing in than a language in the sense of natural language, but still a language. And then on the modularity of mind, the idea that the mind is to some extent divided into semi-autonomous modules for vision and various other mental activities, and so the work that he was doing there, he's a philosopher. He writes like a philosopher, but at the same time, what he's talking about is how the mind, and he's particularly interested in the human mind, how it actually works in some way. And so it would be silly to say that these works of his are not philosophy, but it would also be silly to say that they're not psychology. I mean, they're simply in an area of theoretical reflection on the mind, which is of great interest both to philosophers and to psychologists. So, I think a very natural classification is that this is simply an area where philosophy and psychology overlap. And, an area that I'm at least a little familiar with because it's in fact I've used it in thinking about the role of reasoning in philosophy and in philosophical method, is debates on the psychology of reasoning. For example, these concern interpretation of sort of famous experiments by Johnson, Laird, and Wasson on selection task where which from the beginning were interpreted in partly philosophical terms. I mean, about whether it was that people had some kind of irrational bias in favor of as it were, verification rather than falsification, where that was thought of in kind of Karl Popper's terms, and where and then some of the work on interpreting what's going on in those experiments has brought in philosophical ideas, for example, from deontic logic about the role of oughts, because people are talking about various kinds of rule and violation of rules and so on. And then just in my own recent book, which came out this year, Suppose and Tell, which is on the semantics and heuristics of conditionals. It's I've been using ideas from psychology to think about how it is that we assess conditionals, how we assess statements of the form if X, then Y. And I mean, there's an aspect of that book which I think it would be quite fair to describe as speculative psychology. I'm making hypotheses about what the sort of overall structure of the cognitive processes involved in assessing conditionals typically is. And so, I mean, those are psychological claims. They're not purely, well, they're certainly not just conceptual claims or anything like that. And I think in the long run, psychological work in this area will show whether that approach is the right one or not. But I think I'm certainly writing as a philosopher, not as somebody who's, as it were, professionally a psychologist, because I think that the coming at these issues from the standpoint of a philosopher and of someone with a particular interest in the logic of conditionals helps one to formulate sort of general hypotheses about the overall structure of the assessment of conditionals, which might not be so salient if you were coming at this from a purely psychological point of view, because it's the abstract, logical and philosophical way of thinking about these things, which is at a sufficient level of generality to be able to see what the overall patterns are here, or over what they may be, in order to develop a general hypothesis. And then, of course, all of that has to be implemented in more detail, and at some point, all of this can sooner or later be experimentally tested. But I think it's important to have some hypotheses that are properly developed before they're tested in an area like this. So again, I would think of that kind of work on conditional thinking as having both a philosophical and a psychological side. And relatedly, work that I've done on the cognitive role of the imagination is clearly, in one respect, a kind of speculative psychology, but it's also a contribution to epistemology, to explaining how it is that we can know certain kinds of things by using our imaginations. How the imagination has a cognitive aspect, and I think it would be ridiculous to worry about exactly how to classify these as philosophy or psychology, as though there had to be a clear split between the two. I mean, you can talk about different aspects of it having a more philosophical emphasis or a more psychological one, but really you're just talking about whether particular bits of work how far they're similar to certain kind of paradigms of psychology and how far they're similar to paradigms of philosophy. But there's no underlying natural division here between the philosophy and the psychology, except, of course, for the division that of the kind that we've seen before, the institutional division between people who work in philosophy departments and people who work in psychology departments. Just some more examples here about the nature of the overlap. So there are debates on the nature of consciousness, and if you look at the work of someone like Ned Block, it's just a combination of philosophy and psychology. And again, it would be, I mean, of course, some of it is kind of quite obviously psychological as we classify things because he's appealing to experiments and so on, but it's all in a single argument, and it would be silly to worry about whether to classify that as philosophy or psychology. And then in the case of the hypothesis of the extended mind, the idea that in some sense, when we use various kinds of instruments, like a diary where we keep notes for ourselves, that in effect is just an extension of our mind, and that it's a relatively unimportant matter whether we use for memory as well our own brain or some external object such as a notebook. And that's a hypothesis which was put very clearly and vividly by in a short article by David Chalmers and Andy Clark, but that's been immensely influential, and it's been influential in psychology as well as in philosophy. I mean, in many of these cases, you can see just how influential these things have been on the psychology side, because if you look up their citation numbers, where they're getting their citations from, you see that what the influence is. So that, I mean, it's something that can be quite easily documented. And another area of where these two subjects have combined is in response to the XPhi, the experimental philosophy movement, which I was talking about in relation to thought experiments and the negative program, which has criticized them, and then subsequent work. So this concerns joint research by philosophers and psychologists, where they're investigating, for example, people's judgments about what counts as knowledge and what counts as doing something intentionally, and they're doing it by testing people's verdicts on various hypothetical scenarios, which are similar to those of thought experiments studied by philosophers. And one aspect of this, which is interesting, is that whereas in most of the cases that I've been talking about, the overlap between philosophy and psychology has been in the very, very theoretical end. In this tradition of what, in a kind of broad sense, one can call experimental philosophy, not implying that it's anything to do with the negative program. What we actually have is research collaboration in experimental work. So it's now you often have a philosopher and a psychologist, or several philosophers and several psychologists, as we're forming a team to design and carry out experiments of this kind, this survey kind, to see how people classify certain cases that they're presented with hypothetically. And so, it might be that the philosophers perhaps are more concerned with the overall design of the experiment, and the psychologists are more concerned with the actual implementation of it. But they're working as a team, and they're producing joint papers, which are contributions to psychology, but they're of obvious philosophical interest, because they're showing things about how people ordinarily think about certain kinds of example. And although I don't think that we can do philosophy just on the basis of such experiments, I think it's obvious that these investigations are philosophically as well as psychologically interesting. So that's an example where the sort of overlap between philosophy and psychology can happen at the level of experimentation, whereas most of the time I've been talking about overlap at the level of theory. And now I'll say something about the case of philosophy and linguistics, because again, this is another area where you find that semantics is a classic case. That if you look at people who are doing formal semantics as a branch of linguistics, then the kind of work that they're doing is very, very close to the kind of work which is being done by many philosophers of language, and these people, they're reading each other's papers, they're going to some of the same conferences, and so on. And in fact, in this area, a lot of the main theoretical frameworks come from philosophy, and then have been used by and developed by linguists. And I mean, there are a number of linguists who played a very key role in bringing the philosophical work into linguistics, and then developing it for linguists' purposes, like Barbara Hall Party, Angelika Kratzer, Irene Heim, and others. And so just a number of examples of this. There's, an early case is Bertrand Russell's theory of definite descriptions, which he developed not out of any interest in linguistics, but because he needed it both in order to formalize sort of the mathematical language where we talk about the value of a function or something like that using a definite description, but also in relation to metaphysical disputes with people like Meinong. But in doing that, he produced what is in effect a formal semantics for the definite article, which in English would be the. And that has been very influential in linguistics. I mean, there are not many linguists now who accept exactly Russell's account of the semantics of definite descriptions, but there are certainly views out there which are kind of clear descendants of Russell's view, and the debate about how the semantics of definite descriptions work is one which started in philosophy with Russell, and then with P.F. Strawson's critique of Russell and so on, and which has now moved partly into linguistics. Then another example is Montague grammar, named after the philosopher and logician Richard Montague, which is started as a kind of application of a very sophisticated abstract kind of an early form of semantics for modal logic to natural languages. Well, I guess one of the first linguists to identify this as something that was helpful for their purposes was Barbara Hall-Partee. And that's that kind of framework, which, as I say, was developed within really this sort of the semantics of modal logic, and with input from other things as well, has been extremely influential as a general framework in formal semantics. And a lot of formal semantics also uses the sort of intentional semantics, as we might now call it possible world semantics, which was pioneered by Rudolf Carnap, and then whose sort of full power was revealed by people like Saul Kripke, David Lewis, Robert Stolnaker, and so on. And so that was, again, something that was originally developed within the philosophy of language, but then applied within linguistics. And now a huge amount of the work that's done in formal semantics as a branch of linguistics is done within the framework of intentional semantics. And then some other examples, there's the treatment of indexicals, which is also done within this broadly intentional framework by David Kaplan, which was showing how to model expressions like demonstratives such as this and that, for example, or I and you, now and here, and so on, whose reference depends on the context in which they're used, how to model them within the framework of intentional semantics. And some of the conjectures that Kaplan's put forward have been mainly discussed by linguists. So that, I mean, Kaplan has a notion of a monster, which is an operator that works in a certain kind of way in relation to the indexicality, and the question, and he had the hypothesis that natural languages don't contain any operators of this kind, that there are no monsters, as he puts it, in natural language, and that's been debated. I mean, I guess it may be that the majority view amongst linguists now is that natural languages do contain such operators, but that's a hypothesis put forward by a philosopher of language, which has been very, very fertile in linguistics for the investigation of natural languages. The situation semantics, as developed by John Perry and John Barwise, a philosopher and a logician, which suggested for certain purposes that we need to replace possible worlds by, as it were, smaller little bits of worlds that we can think of, called situations. And again, that's been taken over and has become, by linguists such as Kratzer, and has become extremely influential in formal semantics. Then there's, for example, discourse representation theory by Hans Kamp, who started out as a logician in philosophy departments, but whose work, which is relevant to things like the reference of pronouns and aphora and so on, has been widely influential in linguistics. There's a different tradition which goes back to Tarski, and Tarski, the kind of formal theory of truth that Tarski developed within logic, and mainly taken up by philosophers, as opposed to the tradition going back to Carnap, but that was also used quite influentially by Donald Davidson and his work on adverbs and events, which has been influential on linguists. I guess one of the people on the kind of boundaries between linguistics and philosophy of language here was James Higginbotham, who was one of the ones who was interested in applying Davidson's work within linguistics, and quite influentially. And then going back a little bit further, there are philosophers such as Peter Geach and Gareth Evans, who worked on pronouns. And the philosophers' interest in pronouns was because of the idea that pronouns work something like the bound variables, the x's and y's in first order logic, and a question of whether, I mean, they do that. I mean, that was a kind of hypothesis sort of associated with people like Quine, and so a tradition within philosophy emerged of working on pronouns because of the interest that they had in relation to formal languages. So you'll notice that with a lot of these examples, it's the philosophical logic that's the relevant part of philosophy. But all of these show the huge influence that that philosophy has had on that branch of linguistics. Another branch of linguistics on which philosophy has been very influential is pragmatics, because again, much of its overall theoretical orientation comes from philosophy, and particularly on work done by the Oxford linguistic philosophers in the 1950s and 60s. So J.L. Austin's work on speech acts, Peter Strawson's work on presuppositions, and Paul Grice's work on conversational and conventional implicature. I mean, those are all ideas which philosophers of language came up with, and which have produced and proved immensely fertile for pragmatics as a branch of linguistics. And you can see signs of this overlap still in the existence of crossover journals, for example, Linguistics and Philosophy and Mind and Language are crossover journals that are contributed to and read by both philosophers and linguists, and joint workshops. And then another kind of border that philosophy has is with economics. So there are institutionally, you can see this in the existence of crossover journals such as Theory and Decision and Economics and Philosophy, And you can also see it in the careers. So John Broome and Ken Binmore are examples of people who started their careers as economists, and their interests led them into philosophy. But again, it wasn't that they abandoned the kind of things that they'd been working on in economics, but it was just that the questions that they were asking in economics naturally led them in the direction of philosophy. And one very strong and important area of overlap between philosophy and economics is in decision theory, that typically using a formal apparatus with probabilities and utilities, and where you're interested in something like the expected utility of different possible actions that you could take, and so that kind of decision theory is central to discussions of rational action in both philosophy and economics. And again, I mean, you can see philosophers and economists discussing these questions together. And an area maybe not so obvious, but one that I've worked on a lot, and so I'm very aware of, is the area of epistemic and doxastic logic, the logic of knowledge and belief. And the key text in the founding of this was by the Finnish philosopher Jaakko Hintikka, Knowledge and Belief, published in 1962, which is very much a philosopher's book. I mean, he's interested in issues about whether if you know that you know, and if you don't know, you know that you don't know, and so on. And so he's coming at these issues as a philosopher, and he's applying something like the apparatus of modal logic, but with epistemic and doxastic interpretations. But then a lot of the applications of this have been made by economists, and later actually by computer scientists. And one of the things that they're interested in is that this the kind of formal apparatus that Hintikka developed can be very naturally applied to the analysis of common knowledge, where everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows something. And common knowledge is very important in theoretical economics, because when you look at arguments in, for example, game theory, which theoretical economists use a lot to think about fundamental issues, often there's an assumption, it seems, of common knowledge in game theory. For example, common knowledge of what the game is, common knowledge of what the possible outcomes and their utilities are, and possible and common knowledge of the rationality of the players in the game. So that you're assuming that you know that they know that you know that they're rational, and vice versa. And in fact, a lot of the research on epistemic and doxastic logic has been done by theoretical economists. But it was work that could just as, I mean, these were questions that could have occurred to philosophical logicians as well. But it so happened that the economists were the ones who were more motivated to explore this area. And I mean, there are some superficial differences in the way that they study it, because they tend to think of it in terms of set theoretical frameworks, rather than the kind of more linguistic frameworks that you get if you think about modal logic. But those differences are often relatively superficial, and the actual technical questions are pretty much the same, whether you put them in the way that a philosopher doing epistemic logic would put them, or in the way that a theoretical economist doing it would put them. And you can recognize that they're the same question. There's another aspect, a quite different aspect of the interaction between philosophy and economics, and in fact, more generally, the interaction between philosophy and the social sciences, which the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson has noted. And that's that the social sciences tend to be done with a kind of value-free ideology. In other words, where it's important to their conception of themselves as social scientists that their research is value-free, that they're not making any, they're not prejudging any questions of value in doing their research. But at the same time, although they would like to think of themselves as scientists, and they take that to involve doing value-free work, the kind of questions that they're dealing with often are ones with a very strong potential normative aspect, because they're talking about the distribution of goods in society, and the social scientists, in fact, are thinking of some of these potential outcomes as much better than others, and some as much worse. And as what Anderson pointed out was that by interacting with philosophers, the social scientists can actually talk about the value questions that in fact interest and sometimes motivate them in a kind of respectable way, because philosophy provides a zone in which explicit discussion of value is permitted, because we have moral and political philosophy where part of our job is to talk about these value questions. So just for the sake of completeness, I'll mention a couple of other issues which I won't mainly talk about here, but in the case of philosophy and history, I talked about their relation in the previous lecture, and we saw that, of course, there's overlap, but both in relation to the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history, and so there are strong connections there as well. And then, as it were, a very different kind of case would be the case of philosophy and mathematics, which I'm very aware of, again, teaching at Oxford, because we have a degree that undergraduates can do in mathematics and philosophy. In fact, that was my undergraduate degree. That's what I studied as an undergraduate. And again, it's a combination that draws many very, very able undergraduates. And of course, the most obvious area of overlap is mathematical logic. And again, there are the kind of institutional signs of overlap with crossover journals like the Journal of Symbolic Logic, the Review of Symbolic Logic, the Journal of Philosophical Logic, and careers. So Hugh Woodin at Harvard and Joel David Hampkins at Oxford are examples of people whose career was initially in mathematics departments doing set theory, but their interests always had a philosophical aspect to them, and they both ended up, or at least for the time being, in philosophy departments, but without any as a way, discontinuity in the kind of research that they were doing. It's just that because it had a philosophical aspect to it, it was natural for them to do it in a philosophy department as well. And I mean, well, some areas where we get this kind of interaction between philosophy and mathematics at the moment are with the status of axioms for set theory, and in alternative foundations, or supposed alternative foundations for mathematics, such as category theory and homotopy type theory. So those are issues that both philosophers and mathematicians want to talk about. And actually, I'll be talking about them in detail in my lecture on mathematical philosophy and philosophical mathematics, which is on the 9th of November. And that's commemorating Bertrand Russell's visit in 1920, I think, over to continuing into 21 to China, and in particular, I think, to Peking University. So that's a kind of survey of the way in which philosophy overlaps and interacts with all sorts of other disciplines. And I want to spend a little bit of time as we're drawing the threads together and seeing whether we can discern any more general patterns. And of course, a typical pattern is that other disciplines at some point break away from philosophy and become autonomous. That's not the case with all the other disciplines that I've been talking about. I don't think it's the case with, well, it's pretty obviously not the case with history, and it's not the case with, for example, linguistics, as far as I know, which seems to have developed somewhat separately from philosophy. But with many of the disciplines that I was talking about, they originate in an intellectual tradition that was once part of philosophy and then has broken away from it. And they've become autonomous in the sense that they, as it were, then they're not just considered as subordinate to philosophy, and they're not subordinate. And so one kind of view is that, as it were, when a discipline is in a kind of somewhat confused state without any very clear methods and so on, it counts as philosophy. And then once it establishes clear methods, and then it gets to be a separate discipline. I mean, I think that's the wrong way of thinking of it. Although it's not completely wrong, because of course these other areas did develop their own disciplines. But I think, in fact, that it's not part of the definition of philosophy that it as it were, has to lack rigorous methods, as I've been explaining. And I think the way in which logic, it remains a part of, at least in the case of philosophical logic, part of philosophy, is a good example of that. But also, it's worth mentioning that the other disciplines which I've been talking about, to the extent to which they're ever part of philosophy, they achieved autonomy from it a long time ago. And the kind of connections with philosophy that I've been talking about, they're not just some kind of anachronistic trace of the past, some kind of, as it were, remains that nobody's tidied away, but they're actually a current need. I mean, the kind of connections that I've been sketching are all ones that developed after the separation, if there was if they were ever together, so it's they're not just leftovers from the past. There's something that reflect current intellectual needs. And then we might ask what philosophy contributes to these interactions. So I think there are actually a number of different things which philosophy can contribute, and so we're not always talking about a single type of contribution. But I think one thing that philosophy often contributes is a capacity to identify, articulate, and question very general assumptions underlying a debate. And so you might say that it can think outside the box when it wasn't obvious even that the debate was in a box. I'm not suggesting that philosophy is always conscious of all its own assumptions or anything like that. I think that's too much to ask of any discipline. But I think the very sort of abstract and structural way in which philosophers think and in particular that their interest in dialectics and as well as the rules of argument and so on help to enable philosophers to play this kind of role. And it's not that it's radically different from what can happen even by people, as it were, in one of these other disciplines who are not in contact with philosophy. I mean, obviously, some capacity to identify, articulate, and question assumptions is present in any kind of reflective discipline. But I think that if you like, the kind of skill set that philosophers have does make them unusually good at this, and unusually, as we're comfortable at working in at a very high level of generality and abstraction, and so that they've got something to contribute at this level because their training and skill set is somewhat different. With not that it's, as it were, utterly different in kind, but that the emphasis is different, and therefore some skills are developed more than in other areas and others less. Then there's the point which I mentioned was made by Elizabeth Anderson that philosophy can make considerations of value explicit. And that is quite an unusual feature of philosophy. I'm not saying that it's unique, but most academic disciplines do more or less consciously try to avoid value judgments. Whereas in moral and political philosophy, of a first order kind, value judgments are often what the subject is about. And so that gives philosophers this capacity to raise a different kind of question that people in the neighboring disciplines are often, not always, but often are barred by their own disciplinary norms from asking. But as it were, if someone will do it for them, they may be quite grateful. So that's a quite different kind of contribution that philosophy can make. I think another kind is that it can sometimes supply a precise formal framework for theorizing. And I think that's something that analytic philosophy is actually especially good at, because it's got this close connection with logic and its willingness also to use mathematical methods. And so some of what we saw in some of the previous examples was philosophers being able to do that kind of thing. And so in the interaction with linguistics, what the philosophers of language were supplying was something like a precise formal framework for thinking about the semantics of languages, and then in the case of economics with epistemic logic, that's again a precise formal framework, which the philosophers supplied. In fact, it's the formal framework of epistemic logic and the formal framework of intentional logic are actually in some respects the same. So this is a way in which, as where the possible world's revolution in philosophy of the 1960s and 70s has been exported to a number of other disciplines, and that was something that, as it were, developed in philosophy, particularly because of philosophy's close connection with logic, which is a closer connection than economics and linguistics in general have. And so, you know, even if you might think that in principle there was nothing to stop linguists from making as we're thinking of these things for themselves, in practice, it was much more likely to come from philosophers, given the kinds of skills and intellectual connections that they have. So, as I've mentioned, and as I think these examples show, it's not the case that philosophy's contributions to other disciplines are all of the same kind. They're diverse. But I mean, we could say in a very general way that that philosophy's great generality, and then a further thing, which is its tolerance of strangeness, give it a flexibility which enables it to interact fruitfully with many other disciplines. Of course, I mean, philosophy is not the only subject that is quite tolerant of strangeness. You might think, for example, that the very fundamental physics is tolerant of strangeness, but it is a feature that philosophy has, that as it were, philosophers are on the whole trained not to dismiss ideas as too strange. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we always stick to that, but I think that is an aspect of the way in which philosophers operate, which enable them to engage fruitfully with many other disciplines. A different sort of consideration, which I'll just mention, is a somewhat unfortunate one, which is that philosophers who work closely with another discipline sometimes come out respecting it more than philosophy. And it might be that it was because they respected it more than philosophy all along that they wanted to work with it, or it might be that it was as a result of working with it that they started to respect it more than philosophy. So that, for example, you know, sometimes philosophers who have a lot to do with psychology end up somehow having more respect for psychology than philosophy. It's not that all do, but some do, and you sometimes find that philosophers imitate and envy role models from that other discipline rather than from philosophy, and that they try to follow its aims and methods, so that, as it were, they follow, you know, well, just to take the case of philosophers and psychologists, in some cases, but not by any means all, the philosophers who have a lot to do with psychology, they want to, they try to talk and think like psychologists. Now, I mean, it's not that the results from that are never valuable. I mean, sometimes the results are in effect that philosophers who kind of envy another discipline that they're close to, that they end up as writing something which is more like popularizing the other science or whatever it is that they envy. But sometimes it's more than popularization. It is that they are in effect pursuing this kind of theoretical role, but as well, they're more like just a very theoretical member of the other discipline, and they lose a lot of their distinctiveness as philosophers, and so it's not always a bad thing, but I think it often involves a kind of lack of understanding of what the distinctive features of philosophical methodology are, and so sometimes you end up with the strange phenomenon of philosophy hating philosophers, and they're a menace. I mean, they're a danger, and I think one thing that happens with philosophers who go down that path is that they tend to abandon the distinctive skills and intellectual resources of philosophy, and as a result, they actually bring much less to the interdisciplinary table than they could. I remember once hearing a talk by a philosopher who's had a lot to do with psychology, quite a distinguished one, but I won't say who it is, and who and the talk was to a kind of combined audience of philosophers and psychologists, but it had a lot of psychological material in it, but was very lacking in philosophical rigor and subtlety, and I remember talking with him afterwards and making some kind of quite ordinary philosophical distinction in objecting to what he had to say, and his reply was, "Oh, I don't make distinctions like that anymore because psychologists tend not to understand them." And it seemed to me that was a rather sad reply to make, because it wasn't that he had any real objection to the distinction, but just that as it were, he'd given up worrying about these philosophical concerns, because the people that he was concerned to impress were the psychologists, and I guess he didn't mind too much if he no longer impressed the philosophers. But it seems to me that it's exactly those kind of distinctions, which are in the case I'm talking about, were highly relevant to the validity, or as it happened, the invalidity of his arguments. Those distinctions are the ones that we can help by bringing to the discussion. Whereas, if we turn ourselves just into, well, in this case, as it were, a pop psychologist, we're not really going to bring much to a discussion with psychologists. So in the end, it's a kind of counterproductive sort of thing to do. And so part of what I've been trying to do in these lectures is to emphasize that philosophy is not the kind of utterly undisciplined, anarchic sort of enterprise that we should be ashamed of belonging to, but that in fact it has its own quite distinctive forms of intellectual discipline. I mean, distinctive as a kind of in the overall package and the relative emphases, although I mean they're all things which you can find outside philosophy. And and I think we if we understand what we've been doing better, we can not only do it even better than that, but we can also see that we as it were, we really have nothing to be ashamed of. We've got something to be proud of in the kind of methods that we're using. And then just to summarize the kind of argument that I made towards the beginning of the lecture, that philosophy's contiguity or overlap with many progressive disciplines make it plausible that philosophy is progressive too. So once we've seen the kind of underlying continuity in the landscape, which all these different disciplines are regions of, then the idea that philosophy is somehow quite different from all these other ones in not making progress is utterly implausible. Of course, there's still the question, well, exactly what kind of progress are we making? And so in the next lecture, we're going to consider an under-recognized form of progress in many sciences. I think it's under-recognized from, as it were, within philosophy, which is also an under-recognized form of progress in philosophy. So in other words, I think philosophy has been making progress of a kind which is quite similar to what you find in other sciences in some respects. But where it doesn't follow the kind of model that we tend to have of what progress should look like. And so we've been failing to recognize it, and so failing to see the kind of progress that is in fact being made in many of these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Williamson. Your talk want to emphasize that philosophy has more similarity with other scientific disciplines than before we thought. Yes. Now I give a short introduction to our interlocutor and questioner. Dr. Ye Feng receives his PhD from Princeton University. Now is a former professor of philosophy at Capital Normal University. Actually, he is my former colleague at Peking University. He specializes in philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of mind. He is a logician and philosopher. He published the English book in spring. Right now, he is developing his own philosophy. Physicalist philosophy in general, sort of naturalism. Dr. Mei Jianhua is a young man, but a full professor of philosophy at Shanxi University. He specializes in philosophy of mind and experimental philosophy, metaphilosophy, and metaphysics. Welcome, you too. Yes.
Okay. First, I want to thank Professor Williamson for all the talks. I have been following them and have learned a lot from them. And I also want to thank Chen Bo for inviting me to give comments on this lecture and for the introduction. Now, let me share my my screen. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So mostly I will just read my comments in this Word document. So this lecture is about close connections between philosophy and science. If I understand correctly, Professor Williamson discusses at least three aspects of the connection. First, philosophical problems frequently overlap with scientific problems, and many researchers cross over both sides. Second, philosophical ideas used to inspire fruitful scientific researches. Third, scientific knowledge is sometimes essential for answering philosophical questions. Besides, if we understand correctly, a major theme in Professor Williamson's previous lectures and other writings is that methodologically, doing philosophy is not essentially from doing science. This lecture appears to focus on content of philosophy and science, and not their methodology, but the idea are similar. I personally believe that Professor Williamson has made a very strong case for demonstrating similarities between philosophy and science in most important aspects. And personally, I like very much the idea that I'm just doing a highly theoretical and then perhaps a little speculative kind of science. So in this, in the following, for raising questions, I want to explore how far we can push this case of similarity to its extreme. I want to ask this question. Are there any strictly philosophical problems, namely problems that only philosophy can fully and adequately address, and science alone can't? What are those problems, if any, and why do they defy science? Well, first consider, say, philosophy of language. So the question is there any problem about language that is so strictly philosophical that only philosophy can adequately answer it and linguistics can't? Personally, I cannot think of any such a problem. Semantics, pragmatics, for example, are standard linguistic research topics. Any adequate theory about them should be based on observing linguistic data and building models to fit those data. Philosophers certainly can do that. But we can consider it a piece of work in linguistics. That is, it's not, say, exclusively philosophical or not, completely special but philosophical. Now, other problems about language look similar. Some might suggest that theory of truth is strictly philosophical, because it concerns a connection between the inner mental world and the external world. However, some philosophers believe that truth can be naturalized. A naturalistic characterization of truth will look like a theory in cognitive science. It will postulate a human cognitive architecture, postulate how concepts and thoughts are realized in their human cognitive architecture, and then propose a model about how concepts and thoughts are connected to things in human environments, which are then considered the relations, conceptual representation, and truth. One can then test the model against observational data, that is, against our intuitive observations about how various concepts and thoughts represent things and states of our environments. Such a theory will be a standard cognitive scientific theory. Now, some philosophers might deny the possibility of naturalizing truth. So my next question is the idea that there are strictly philosophical problems tied to the assumption that some aspects of the mind somehow defy all scientific investigations, including all cognitive scientific modeling attempts? What exactly can make an aspect of the mind elude all potential cognitive scientific modeling? A similar comment can be made about epistemology. Quine used to say that epistemology should be a branch of psychology, and a projection claims that epistemology should be a normative theory, while psychology is merely descriptive. However, some philosophers believe that we can explain normativity in terms of evolution and biological functions. More specifically, the biological purpose of human cognitive mechanisms is for achieving truth. Therefore, if truth is naturalized, then epistemic virtues of a cognitive mechanism should be naturalistic properties as well. Namely, qualities that can allow the cognitive mechanism to achieve more truth or to achieve truth in some better ways. This means that epistemology will become a branch of cognitive science for evaluating various human cognitive mechanisms for the purpose of achieving truths. It will perform such evaluations based on postulating a human cognitive architecture and postulating how cognitive mechanisms are realized on such a cognitive architecture. It again appears that if one claims that epistemology is strictly philosophical, then one must be assuming that something about the mind related to epistemology will elude all potential cognitive scientific modeling. Now, there are things in the mind for which we seem to have strong intuitive reasons to think to be beyond all scientific modeling. They are the so-called phenomenal characters, or what it is likeness of our phenomenal experiences. However, if that is all that can defy science, it is not very much. When philosophers traditionally study truth, knowledge, ethics, or philosophy of mathematics, and so on, they are never interested in our phenomenal characters of our phenomenal experiences of achieving truth, knowing things, doing good or evil, or proving mathematical theorems. For instance, we are interested in what justifies our acceptance of a mathematical axiom. Why would one be interested in one's phenomenal characters of one's phenomenal experiences of accepting the axiom? So even if we admit that these irreducibly subjective, private, and first-personal things defy all scientific modeling, it probably will not save any interesting part of traditional philosophy from being taken over by science. So let me repeat the last question in another format. Is it true that all legitimate non-scientific investigations are just our introspective examinations of our own private, subjective, phenomenal characters of our own feelings, and all other legitimate investigations are essentially scientific investigations? If that is true, then should we just admit that we philosophers are just doing science? So probably the highly theoretical and a little speculative part of science. if that's not true, then what exactly are the other aspects of a mind? Aspects other than one's subjective phenomenal characters of one's feelings that can resist all cognitive scientific modeling and at the same time are relevant to true knowledge, justification, and so on. Relevant to what traditionally interests us in philosophy. And next question is, why can't scientific modeling fully treat these aspects of the mind? Well, that's my comments and questions. Where should I can here start sharing.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Williamson. It's a wonderful talk. Yeah, I have 3 questions. So, okay. My questions concern interdisciplinary research and the value of philosophy. So my first question is how to understand the relation between philosophy and other disciplines. This is a series of questions. Second, can cognitive science be helpful to metaphysics? The third is, what can scholars from some disciplines, for example, psychology, learn from philosophy of mind? Let me explain the first question. There are 2 kinds of relations. R1, the relationship between philosophy and other disciplines. For example, philosophy of mind and psychology, linguistics and philosophy of language, biology and philosophy of biology. So there is R1 interdisciplinary research. Experimental philosophy is the intersection between psychology and philosophy. Moral psychology is the intersection research between ethics and psychology. This is R1 relation. R2 relation. This is the relationship among other disciplines. For example, psychology and linguistics, biology and economics. R1 interdisciplinary research. For example, behavior economics is the intersection research between psychology and economics. So, how to understand R1 and R2? On the one hand, we intuitively feel that R1 and R2 are different. There is a philosophy of X, but there seems to be low, for example, biology of X. Behind this intuition reveals that philosophy is different from other disciplines. Someone may think that philosophy is above all the other disciplines, and it becomes the foundation of other disciplines. In particular, to emphasize this distinction, some hold the position philosophy is the study of concepts, while science is the study of facts, emphasizing the distinction between philosophy and science. On the other hand, Quine said that philosophy and science are continuous, and there is no essential difference between them. Philosophy is a stage of science, and even claims that philosophy is a philosophy of science enough. So, how to understand R1 and R2? Are they the same or different? Professor Williamson said, philosophy of mind is not the only branch of philosophy that learns. We should learn from psychology. I agree with this point. Leave aside the lecture program of experimental criticism on intuition. Actually, experimental philosophy is a branch that learns from psychology. Joshua Loeb claims that experimental philosophy is a cognitive science. So, how to understand interdisciplinary research of philosophy and other fields? what are the differences between the two kinds of interdisciplinary research? Furthermore, how to locate the role of empirical method and conceptual analysis method in philosophy and science. This is my first question. My second question is, can cognitive science be helpful to metaphysics? Professor Williamson put forward two dimensions on the study of time, physics and metaphysics study of time. And I agree you that in the study of metaphysics, the basic theory of physics should not be ignored. But we also need psychological research on time. This part of research is returned to human perception, but not closely related to physical theory. The real cognitive metaphysics is actually to understand metaphysics from cognitive science, such as causality, time, and individuation. In this kind of study, it seems that theory of relativity does not need to be mentioned. So my question is, can cognitive science be helpful to metaphysics? Furthermore, there's a paper Evan Goodman read. He wants to bridge the metaphysics and the cognitive science. In this abstract, he claimed, concerning the problem of event individuation, there exist many 2 points of value, the unifier value and the multiplier value, while the evidence given by cognitive science manifested as 2 groups of participants in a debate are theorizing about the reference of 2 different types of mental representation. We should abandon the original assumption of both values, that exactly one of the values is right. Instead, we should conclude that both are right. The best solution is to countenance 2 metaphysical categories of events. This is how cognitive science can play a role in metaphysics. So my additional question is, can cognitive science be more helpful to metaphysics rather than physics? Last question. In this speech, Professor Williamson made it talk about how philosophers learn from other science in method, theories, conclusions, and how scholars from some disciplines, such as linguistics, economics, learn from philosophy, philosophy of language, and epistemology. I want to ask specific questions. In the field of consciousness research or artificial intelligence research, can philosophy do any truly effective solution to these essential problems? That's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you both for your questions. I'll go through and answer as many of them as I can. So I think one issue that needs to be clarified between Ye Fong and me was the question of what we mean by science, because sometimes he was using philosophy to mean something that's different from science, but then he was also at the end saying maybe philosophy just is science. But I think, as I understood him, a lot of the time when he was talking about science, what he specifically had in mind was natural science, and in my view, philosophy is part of science, but it's not part of natural science. And I think of an easier example to show the difference between science and natural science is that I take it that mathematics is a science, but not a natural science, whereas physics, biology, chemistry, and so on, they're all natural sciences. And so I think a lot of the time when he was talking about science, what he had in mind, as far as I could see, was natural science. So the first of his questions was about whether there are any strictly philosophical problems, and these were meant to be questions that philosophy might answer, but that science alone can't answer. And of course, if on my understanding, if philosophy can answer them, then of course science can answer them, because philosophy is part of science. But if we're talking about natural science, I think that yes, that there are questions in philosophy which natural science can't answer, because there are questions. Well, for example, questions in philosophical logic are ones which natural science is not suitable for answering. And another one in metaphysics was the question of physicalism. I mean, roughly speaking, whether the only objects and properties and relations that there are physical objects, properties, and relations. And I don't think that natural science is an appropriate discipline or group of disciplines for answering the question of physicalism, simply because its concern is just with the physical world, and so it's not in a good position to ask whether there are other things that it's not concerned with. And I think if we handed over the question of physicalism to the physical sciences, we might we'd be liable to get a very biased answer. I mean, probably the answer yes, but I think we need something that's a little bit less committed to one side, and I think philosophy is in a better position to do that than any natural science to assess the question of physicalism. Then there was a question of whether, for example, concerning language, there are any distinctively philosophical questions. So, I mean, I think that the kind of theories that I was mentioning in semantics are not really ones that natural science was very well equipped to come up with, because these were theories that, I mean, for example, the intentional framework, which is the possible worlds framework for semantics, which is, although, I mean, maybe somebody in cognitive science could come up with that, but it seems, when you think about how it emerged from the philosophical tradition in terms of consideration of modal logic and so on, I think philosophy was much more likely, much better able to come up with the intentional frameworks than a more naturalistic approach. And another type of question about language, which and the naturalistic approach might not be well equipped to answer, is about what are necessary conditions for being a language, because the naturalistic approach is mainly focused on human language, but there's nothing necessary about the idea that all language has to be human. I mean, there's nothing to stop intelligent aliens from other galaxies having languages which are rather different from human languages. And I think the greater kind of generality of philosophy is, in some way, makes it better equipped than a more naturalistic approach to consider questions about what is strictly necessary for being a language. And then another issue that was mentioned was the question of truth, and the suggestion was that really something like cognitive science would be the best science for producing a good theory of truth. But I mean, the notion of truth it's a quasi-logical idea. I think the fundamental aspect of truth was already articulated by Aristotle when he said that to say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, is true, and to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. I mean, I think that already captures the fundamental aspect of the difference between truth and falsity, and he's not relying on cognitive science there. And the kind of thing that he's saying is something that's more naturally articulated as, a quasi-logical theory of truth, and that can be done. But typically cognitive science applies logic rather than produces logic itself. And in fact, I think if we tried to get a theory of truth from cognitive science, we'd be liable to end up with some kind of epistemic theory of truth, some theory about what we recognize as true rather than just what is true. And I mean, the limitations of epistemic theories of truth have been very thoroughly explored over the last 50 years, and I think the kind of arguments that have been produced there make it pretty clear that truth is not an epistemic matter. It's much closer to being a logical one. Then on the second question, which was whether some aspects of the mind defy a scientific approach, I mean, I agree with Yehong that phenomenal characters are really not an important thing. That if somehow they were left over by a scientific approach, that would really not be a very big gap. I mean, my own assumption is that in the long run, probably cognitive science can give, and psychology can give some kind of account of what we call phenomenal characters, so that it's not going to be a gap. I mean, that particular thing is not going to be a gap in what a naturalistic science can do. So I don't want to rest anything on that kind of example. But I think the kind of aspect of mind that cognitive science and other natural sciences might not be in the best investigation to best position to investigate are issues like the necessary conditions for being a mind, because the range of possible minds, of course, is much wider than just human minds, and maybe much wider than just all the minds there are on Earth. I mean, of course, we get a bit more generality by thinking of artificial intelligence, but I think the cognitive cognitive science is typically much more interested in questions about what's distinctive about the particular kind of mind that it's dealing with, rather than concerned with these more general questions about what it takes to have a mind in the first place. So I think there are, as were some very general questions about mind like that, which are not best dealt with by natural science, or in particular by cognitive science. And I would say the same about epistemology. I mean, Quine put forward this program of naturalized epistemology, but he didn't really have much success with it. I mean, his own particular approach was a very sort of crudely internalist one. But I think a lot of the questions in epistemology are, again, at a somewhat more abstract level. I mean, so for example, one issue that I've been interested in is the relation between evidence and knowledge, and the questions about whether if you know that you know, and again, these seem like quasi logical questions, not purely logical, but they have more of a logical character. And although I think we can answer these questions in a scientific way, I don't think it will be a very much of a natural scientific way. I think we have to remember that some questions, get answered by mathematical reasoning, and then philosophy is something which has some features in common with natural science, but some features in common with mathematics, in particular on its reliance on thinking much more than on experimentation. And so I think that although the appropriate approach to all these questions is a scientific one, I don't think it will be a natural scientific one. And then I think your third question was really a variant, as you said, on the second question, was about whether introspection is the kind of the only alternative to a scientific study. And as I say, I think, again, my answer is the same, that if by scientific you mean natural scientific, then the kind of alternative to what we learn by natural scientific investigation that I would propose is not introspection at all, but is something like the kind of reasoning that we use in mathematics. But if we're using science in a more general sense, to include mathematics as well as natural science, and I would argue to include philosophy as well, then I think all of these things can be answered scientifically, and there's nothing left over like that. And now to go on to the questions that May Jahua was asking me. So the first question was, as it were, to do with the map of these kind of interdisciplinary relations, and so. For the reasons that I explained, I think they're quite complicated, and there isn't just a sort of one single pattern that covers all of these cases. I think maybe if I go on to the second and third questions, that will make my attitude clearer. So the second question was about what cognitive science might be able to contribute to metaphysics. And I agree that something like, if what we're interested in is for example, the psychology of time, or we might say the phenomenology of time, how we experience time. I agree that for that purpose, we don't need to worry about special relativity. But I take it that the metaphysical question is not how do we experience time, but what is time? And of course, it might be that question then has to be replaced, given special relativity, by something more like what is space-time. So I think that what cognitive science can tell us about mainly here is about what we might call folk metaphysics. I mean, that's to say the kind of view of the world in its, at its most general, that we're psychologically, as we're, if you like, programmed to take in its as a kind of framework for thinking about it. And I certainly agree that cognitive science can tell us about that. And by the way, a philosopher, a metaphysician who's interested in this aspect of cognitive science is my colleague at Yale when I visit there every year, except when there's COVID-19, Laurie Paul, who's interested in those questions. But I think fundamentally, what that sort of pursuit is designed to understand is how we are programmed to think of the nature of the world. But metaphysics itself is to do with what the nature of the world really is. And of course, it's not that the cognitive science aspect is completely irrelevant, because, as it were, it may give us a greater self-understanding, and so makes us aware of what kind of metaphysics we're bringing to questions of metaphysics. For example, when we assess particular examples, whether they're whether such and such an example is a plausible case or whatever, it may well be that we need to know what kind of folk metaphysics we're using in assessing those examples. But fundamentally, that's just a preliminary to asking the questions about, as well, what the world is really like. And I take it that those questions of metaphysics are somewhat more like the questions of physics than questions of cognitive science. So that just as there's a distinction between physics and folk physics, there's a distinction between metaphysics and folk metaphysics. And so, as I say, it seems to me that what cognitive science is giving us is maybe greater self-understanding, which is relevant to approaching metaphysical questions, but doesn't by itself give us the answers to metaphysical questions. And then the third question was about what psychologists can learn from the philosophy of mind. So in the talk, I was giving some examples of that. For example, Jerry Fodor formulating the language of thought and the modularity of mind as sort of hypotheses at a high level about the nature of mind, and at a more specific level, I think the psychology of reasoning, which requires, I mean, the psychology of reasoning takes over from logic various assumptions about what are valid and what are invalid arguments, and so it's using a kind of logic pretty much as a branch of philosophy as an input. It's not that the psychology of reasoning is independently giving us our logic, but the questions that you focused on were two. One was philosophy for consciousness research, and the other was what does philosophy have to offer artificial intelligence. So in the case of consciousness, of course, this is an area which is not very well understood, but philosophers have contributed to a variety of distinctions between different kinds of consciousness, sort of some of them to do with access and some of them individuated in other ways, and so I think that we're contributing something along those lines. Of course, it's not yet that we've that these questions have been fully answered. So it's not clear who's going to get the credit for a solution that we don't yet have. But I think that consciousness is an example where it's not very clear what it is that we are supposed to be studying, and if we're if we're using the term consciousness in some kind of ambiguous way, or a way that covers very disparate phenomena, then consciousness research is itself going to be in trouble. And I think in the long run, I think philosophy has quite a lot to contribute, just to demarcating, what the things are that we need to be understanding here. But of course, that is only a preliminary, and I'm sure that it's not that philosophy can solve all these questions by itself. For artificial intelligence, I think the philosophy's contribution is at the more theoretical end, because it's one thing we need if we're to study artificial intelligence, of course, we need to have an understanding of the general nature of intelligence, because if we just, as we study intelligence in the form that it takes in human beings and maybe higher animals, then we may be conflating intelligence in general with a specific kind of intelligence that biological entities on Earth have, and of course with AI, what we need to be able to do is to look at forms of intelligence which may be quite different from human intelligence, or candidate forms of intelligence which are quite different from human intelligence, and then judge whether they're intelligent but in some other way from the way that we're familiar with. And again, it's not that I think that philosophy by itself is just going to solve all these problems, but I think that the ability to consider the question of what necessary, roughly speaking, necessary and sufficient conditions for intelligence, at least to think about those issues, is that's a kind of question that philosophers are quite used to dealing with, and where the methodology of thought experiments and so on is quite relevant, and it's not really a question that it would be appropriate to leave to AI researchers themselves, because as it were, they have a vested interest in describing what they've produced as a case of intelligence, and so we need to have researchers involved in assessing what the AI researchers have come up with, who have less of a vested interest in giving a positive answer to the question of, is this intelligence? And it seems to me that philosophers are actually better placed than the natural alternatives to answer that question in a comparatively unbiased way. I'm not suggesting that philosophers would be totally unbiased, but at least we don't have a vested interest in one answer over the other. So again, as I haven't answered all the considerations that were brought up, but that's a first shot at my response to those questions. And thanks very much for asking them.
Thank you. This time, I want to take my chair's advantage to ask a question. You talk a lot about close relationship between philosophy and psychology. I'm wondering, what's your comments on psychologism and anti-psychologism by Frege, Husserl in the beginning of last century in philosophy, logic, and mathematics? Maybe you can give some short comments. This is a big question. Yeah, okay.
So basically, I'm very sympathetic to Frege and Husserl, and I think that it is a very bad mistake to confuse questions in logic or mathematics with questions in psychology. And so the fact that there's a close relation between philosophy and psychology, that we've got something to teach them and they've got something to teach us, that's relevant, for example, to understanding the nature of human thinking about mathematics and logic, but that doesn't mean that that the psychologism, should be allowed, that we should take a psychologistic view of what the subject matter of mathematics and logic is, and in fact, even in epistemology, I'm anti-psychologistic in the sense that I think many accounts of evidence, the evidence that we have for or against hypotheses or theories, many kinds of evidence in epistemology they're psychologistic in a bad way, that they just try to assimilate our evidence to certain psychological states, and I think that is also an example of the fallacy of psychologism. So although there is a close relation between philosophy and psychology, I think anti-psychologism is still a fallacy, and fundamentally Frege and Husserl were right about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank all of your three, Professor Williamson, Professor Ye Feng, and Professor Mei Jianhua, for your lecture, comments, and questions and answering. Again, I make an announcement. Next time, Thursday, I have to go another city. So my young colleague, Li Qilin, will chair Thursday lecture. Yes, welcome everyone to be here to next lecture, philosophy and modeling. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Okay.